Morning, everybody. Manager here, and it's 2 minutes past 9:30, so we can officially start this session. Thank you very much to all of you who are attending this workshop in person and online, and to the workshop organizers, Louise and Stephen, our dedicated learning designers in the faculty. I am going to give a very brief introduction to this session and then turn it over to Louise and Stephen, who are going to walk us through this presentation. Louise is going to lead us through the first workshop and Stephen the second one. The first workshop is going to be more theoretical in nature, the second one more hands-on. We were just Stephen, Louise, and I speaking amongst ourselves, and we were thinking it would be great if more people would show up in person for especially the second workshop, which is less theoretical in nature, more hands-on. So, by the way of giving a brief introduction, you all remember that the Middle States Commission on Higher Education, which I'm going to call MISHI from now on for easier. So the Commission's review of our 2016 periodic review report resulted in Athabasca University being placed on warning. That warning was lifted last year following the Commission, the MISHI's team visit, but it didn't mean us being removed from, the warning being removed didn't mean that we were off the hook. So they told us we had more work to do, and that work is basically translating itself in terms of monitoring report, another monitoring report that's due in 2018, and people in various units at this university are working, individually and as groups to draft this report. I am representing our faculty on the committee for drafting this report. The scope of this report is going to be narrower this year compared to the previous one, and its focus is going to be on the progress that Athabasca University has been making towards building a systematic and basically sustainable approach to gathering student learning outcomes data and using that data and information for resource planning and for program improvement. So this is basically a very brief summary of why we are doing this. As the first part of this process in our faculty, we started by looking at the learning objectives for all of the majors in the faculty. Stephen and Louise again led us through that first stage of the process, and we updated our learning outcomes, and then with the help of the templates that they put together for us, we started looking at the core disciplinary courses in each major and mapping those courses, their learning outcomes, and assessment methods to program learning outcomes. We are at the very end of this first stage of the curriculum mapping process. There are a few, to be more accurate, 5 maps that are outstanding, and we are waiting for them to start the second stage. And at the second stage, I believe, all received the email, the communique that I sent out on Friday last week, which basically lists all the other areas that we will be looking at throughout this second stage of the process. Now, the assessment of learning outcomes is embedded, as you will hear Louise state in a few minutes, in this first stage and in the entire curriculum mapping process. So we have been looking at our assessment methods by way of mapping our courses. But we have to go one level high and basically analyze that process. And this is what primarily the second workshop is going to be about. So without further ado, I just turn it over
Leaving the meeting.
To Louise to start the workshop. And I just wanted, as a final remark, to remind everybody that this session is going to be recorded. We are recording it now, right?
Yeah, we are recording already.
Great. So it's being recorded, and people who couldn't attend this meeting will send the recording link out, and they can always access it in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? I hope.
Someone says the sound is fading sometimes. I'm just trying to clarify if that's by the telephone or it's the telephone system. It's fading, but on audio, Adobe, it's fine.
Oh, so the teleconference is not working well?
So maybe speak closer to the mic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have my.
It was when Monica was speaking.
Okay. Stephen is going to be monitoring this session while I'm going to be presenting. As I said, welcome everyone. I hope it's going to be an interesting discussion for everyone. But more importantly, I hope this is going to be a good time, and we're hoping to have your participation, because the most important thing, this is your discussion, and the idea is to have participants sharing questions, sharing expectations and comments. If I can see there are some people online, and here we have as well some people in this room. I would appreciate if just quickly people online introduce themselves, and then we will follow with people in this room. Please, just for everyone to know who is online, and for the people in this room, for the people online to know who is in this room as well. So can you please start online? Just introducing yourself quickly, your name, your role, and that would be great. Thank you.
So people don't have.
Hi, I'm Andy.
It can only be the people on the audio
that they can just do that.
But not everyone is logged in. Some people are only on Adobe. Just so you know.
I teach additional web it's subject composition. Colleen McClure, acting academic coordinator, includes education department program.
This is Wendell Kistner, Mason Program Director.
This is Sarah, psychology. Nina Srivastava, Liquid Tolerance. This is Joyce Racer for Health Administration, Bachelor of General Studies and Bachelor of Professional Arts program.
Do not recommend apology.
This is Evelyn Gagnon from French.
This is Paul Hubener, Assistant Professor of English. Heather Gilbert, Psychology. Marcel, History.
Nina Kolomika, History.
Anyone else online? Anyone else online? If nobody else online, can you please start in this room? Can you please start, Jane?
Jane Arsta, Human Services, Political Science, whatever.
Yeah, Mark Crawford, Political Science.
Theo, diverse legal studies legislative drafting.
Steve Madison, learning designer.
John
Lego editor.
Indie Journal's editor.
Obviously, Manny J is here as well, who welcome everyone at the beginning, and this is Luis Guadarrama once again. So it's very exciting. We have a really big audience. It's so exciting to have all you here. You can see, well,
Joining the meeting.
this is a little bit ambitious, but this is all the topics we already mentioned in that email that was sent a couple of days ago. We just move a little bit, a couple of topics. We didn't erase them, just move them around a little bit for a better organization. And as ambitious as it looks, we're going to try to go through the whole thing. Some preamble, some comments. This is pretty much the organization. We're going to be reviewing briefly the context of learning outcomes in Athabasca University. We're going to discuss the importance of the assessment of learning outcomes. So pretty much the whole session is focused on the assessment of learning outcomes. We're going to be discussing the foundational activities for assessment of learning outcomes. We're going to be discussing strategies for the ongoing assessment of learning outcomes, and we are going to try to clarify what that means. And we are going to be comparing some different approaches for assessing the learning outcomes. In a way, we are going to be trying to discuss where we're coming from, where we at in the process, and where we're going to. But more importantly, I would say this is an excellent opportunity for everyone to discuss as a community how we go in the process for assessing the learning outcomes. You may know there are a lot of discussions university-wide about learning outcomes, and definitely many of you are already participating in these discussions, and I think this is a very exciting moment for everyone and to discuss about how we're going to be doing that. Let me mention something else. It was a little bit challenging to organize this presentation because we have to acknowledge we have some groups that are really advanced in the process. Some of you have already finished the first step and getting ready for the second step. But for you guys, I would say we're going to be building on your work in this conversation, in this discussion. But more importantly, we're going to be celebrating your work and your achievements. We are going to be sharing your experience, but more importantly, it would be great if you share your experience with the others. I think it's very important for everyone to know what is doing the other groups and how they are doing, and it would be very important as well for those groups or professors who are just joining the process or are halfway the process. So we have, what I'm trying to say, we have attendees at different stages in the process, but we are going to be trying our best to make the discussion relevant for all. For those who are just joining the process and for those who are advanced in the process, I'm going to say, yes, there's going to be some familiar topics that we cannot avoid to mention, and definitely for the ones who are joining the process. But we're going to be very brief as possible on discussions we already had. But these ones who are just joining the process, you can always meet the learning designers for further discussion after the workshop or here in the workshop as well. There is another in this audience. We have also professors who are more at the graduate programs, and we have professors who are in the undergrad programs. There's a slight difference. In the undergrad, we have been more used to have these discussions at the course level. I'm not saying that in the undergrad we don't have programs, but this is what has been our business in Athabasca, individualized or individual courses, and pretty much the discussion dominates at that level. While graduate programs, the majority of them are programs who are already completed, and discussions tend to be more at that level, at the program level. I heard, for instance, May's already mapped all the curriculum. Probably this conversation is a little bit more familiar for them, but definitely I think everyone is gonna find a lot of familiar topics. Is just that we're gonna be looking at pretty much the same thing, but from the perspective of the assessment of learning outcomes. So before moving on, and start this conversation, I would like to ask if is there anyone who have any introductory comment or any that you want to share with the group, or any relevant experience that so far you are having with mapping the learning outcomes? If not, well, let's start this conversation. So let's start by referring to this question that actually Maniye was mentioning, why the assessment of learning outcomes. Well, you may know Athabasca University is officially adopting the language of learning outcomes. This is happening right now. There are a lot of discussions, as I said before, and I'm sure you're already participating. I would say something that Maria already mentioned. I would say one of the reasons has to do with program continuous improvement, and this is one of perspectives to see and to discuss about assessment of learning outcomes. This is a perspective that one professor in Ontario was presenting time ago, and I think it's a really good interpretation about how to see the assessment of learning outcomes, and that's exactly the perspective we are taking for this conversation throughout this discussion this morning. You also know that we have our stakeholders. Basically, the main one is the Alberta government, and these. I'm totally sure you are really familiarized with this handbook, which is the Campus Alberta handbook, which is all about program reviews, program evaluations, and program proposals. I'm sure you are related to all of that. I think it's chapter 4 and 5, if I remember well. The second last time that this handbook was updated was in 2015. And I'm not sure if you are aware, but the handbook was recently updated at the end of the last year. I think it was between September and December. And something, if you are not aware, I would suggest to go back to the handbook. The government updated the whole thing and embedded the language of learning outcomes throughout the handbook, and especially in the chapters of related to program evaluation and program proposals, which is a couple of aspects that you are very much working on. And so all the language of the assessment has been the language of learning outcomes has been embedded. They are asking questions, for instance, how to assess the program learning outcomes. I don't know if anybody has an experience about that. It would be great sharing that experience. They're asking questions, for instance, how do you know that your students achieve the learning outcomes? Or how do you assess the program learning outcomes? Or how you actually um, are making sure your students are achieving these program learning outcomes at the end of the program. So this is the kind of questions that you're going to find in the program evaluation chapter in this handbook. Second thing, well, it happens to be that Middle States is one of our stakeholders. They are based in USA, as you may know, and USA is all about learning outcomes as well. And they also updated recently this document that is closely related to the report that Manny was mentioning, and they went from 14 standards to 7 standards. And if I remember well, we're in this report we're addressing standard 2 and 7, or 3 and 7, I guess. But all the document has also embedded the language of learning outcomes. They for the ones who participated the last time they were here, you may be familiar with that. But in our context, coming back to Canada, the adoption of Athabasca University of the adoption of learning outcomes here is not happening in isolation. Learning outcomes has been adopted throughout the provinces. I would say it is. This is coming from one report from the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario. This is 2016. So 2 years ago. I would say the numbers are higher now. Ontario is definitely leading the process, but we are not far from them. But basically, this is it has been happening since probably 5-10 years ago. It's a process that has been adopted, is being adopted across Canada. This slide is about the universities, and this one is about the colleges, where the numbers seem to be a little bit higher. And so this adoption is not something in isolation. We are actually joining this trend of the learning outcomes. Well, we don't have a lot of students coming from USA, but definitely the ones who come from their home institutions are also about learning outcomes, and this has an implication for even in Canada for transferability and mobility for students, basically for the transfer of students' credits, which is one of our main business here in Athabasca University. Visiting students come here and they need to transfer their credits, and what the home institutions are looking at, and definitely when they have already adopted learning outcomes, is the comparison of the curriculums between the home institution and Athabasca's. In Europe as well, it's not that we have a lot of students in Europe, but I wanted to mention Europe because I don't know if you know this Erasmus program. This program is operating in Europe since like 30 years ago. It's all about mobility. This program let students study in one university one semester, and they can move to another country, another university, and I know students who have been probably in 3 different universities during their bachelor's degree, and this mobility is very transparent, is very easy for them, and you may be wondering why. Well, what facilitates actually this mobility is learning outcomes. They were the ones who started with the tuning project in Bologna, I think, in the early 80s. Does anybody has any comments about the benefits you may be aware of AU students in terms of learning outcomes and mobility and transferability? Please, Jane.
Yeah, for me, when we talk about learning outcomes at Athabasca, we've had a sense that it's sort of something that's being foisted on us by our association with middle schools. But actually, when we say why learning outcomes, the answer is because globally there is a convergence that's occurring in the quality assurance systems of higher education. And the leaders are in the OECD countries, and they have been at it through the Bologna process for the last 30 years. And it's filtered over to the US and been adopted there. And so Canada is sort of slow to the game. In the past, the Quality Council within Alberta could say, quality is what we say it is. And that was the beginning and the end of it. So programs like the one that I look after, which is human services, the question was always, how can you show us the quality of what we're proposing? And so it was a natural thing for human services to want to go down this road because it was important for us, me and Mel and my father, to be able to demonstrate that quality came out of this process. And so when I looked into things like prior learning assessment, they have as their underpinning learning outcomes. So this is, this really helps us and our students because it's not only about transferability of credit and student mobility, but it's also about portability of credentials. So in the future, if credentials were, say, housed by an institute like the Distance Learning Institute in Hamburg, Germany, and all of the credentials were vetted by UNESCO and put in the cloud and blockchain, then when students come to us and say, I'm a refugee, I cannot get my transcript because the government changed, I don't want them to know where I am, the college burnt down, it no longer exists. The record of that educational achievement would still be accessible to the owner of the learning, who is the student. And so there are, if you think about the possibility of fraud in credentialing, it's a way of ensuring that there is likely to be less fraud in the future if we can come to a global system of how to vet credit and credentials. And it will make it more difficult for fly-by-night organizations who fake credentials, who sort of can be doctors one day and engineers the next and PhDs the following week, to get away with that kind of behavior. So in part, learning outcomes is a way of ensuring a rough comparison across countries, time, space, and it really is something that benefits students, and that's why I think we want to be going down this path. Learning outcomes is something that we should not just be sort of saying, well, we're doing it because middle states is making us. No, we're doing it because I think we can see that it has benefits for the quality of the education that we provide, and it makes us more confident when we do award transfer credit to students from elsewhere, that we know what we're doing, that we are leaders in this area, and that and that we're going to go this way because it's the way of the future. And that's the view that I have of it. But I know that some people are kind of new to this idea, but there is something called the new Bologna process. It's just starting this year. And what it's asking is for even another level of activity, and that is to add competencies to the learning outcomes so that it's sort of slicing and dicing in multiple ways so that you are really, really sure that the students have employability, skills, competencies, and learning outcomes. So that
Thank you very much, Jane. Just 1 second. Just quickly before other opinions, there are some other people who want to talk. It's totally correct what Jane is saying. It's about serving students, and I'm just pointing out to one of the aspects of learning outcomes about transferability. And part of the answer is transfer of credits, credential recognition, prior learning assessment and recognition. And we are doing all that here in Athabasca University. And when we are when we are engaged in that kind of process, learning outcomes is a key aspect of these processes. Sorry, do you, Mark, have a comment?
Oh, yes, yeah, just at the risk of digression, speaking of the wave of the future and everything, I mean, it's been one of the frontiers of trade negotiations has been mutual recognition agreements for professions and services of various kinds.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering, does learning outcomes, specification of learning outcomes, receive any impetus from that directly? And maybe if it doesn't, is there some need for coordination at some level in at least certain fields because of that? I mean, it's mutual recognition agreements are something that have come up in, I think, the Doha round, the WTO and CETA, and presumably the current NAFTA negotiations as well.
Thank you very much. Before moving on, I think there's someone online with the speaker that is open, and we are getting some noise in this room. Do you mind to mute your telephone if you are not participating, please? Okay. Moving on. I was having a couple of conversations with some colleagues, and definitely with my colleague, learning designer Stephen as well. And I think part of this conversation is to acknowledge that we're kind of like enduring or experiencing a sort of cultural shift. Learning outcomes is not absolutely different from what we have been doing so far. Actually, there are a lot of similarities. And I would say it's about building on our work. But definitely there are some implications in terms of practices, teaching and learning practices, the language that we are using, definitely, the processes and the curriculum design, the way we are approaching curriculum design. And that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. As I said, I'm not trying to do here a translation or a comparison. I'm just showing some of the differences that we are experiencing now in terms of language. And this is a little bit like when you are doing research. When you are new to research, the first thing that you are listening is, well, research has its own language. And if you don't share and you are not aware of this language, it's going to be difficult that you can actually engage in research practice. And a little bit of like that happens with learning outcomes. So what I'm trying to say, I think it's a good idea to get acquainted and related to the language of learning outcomes. And as I said, and I would continue saying, I wouldn't be surprised that you're going to find a lot of similarities. Just by the way, I would recommend this document, The Language of Learning Outcomes, Definitions and Assessments. The Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, they have really great materials. Absolutely. I would definitely and strongly recommend. They have a website. They have a lot of presentations. They have webinars. They have like every month, every 2 months, they have webinars. You can attend them for free. The most important thing, they, as I said, they are the leaders. They are the ones in Canada doing learning outcomes. They started many years ago, and they are doing a lot of research in the field of learning outcomes. And they have all these reports out there, and you can access them. They have really, really good information. They have also a YouTube channel, and you can access all the webinars. This is another excellent, really excellent document. And actually, in a way, what we are discussing today is an interpretation. It definitely reflects this handbook. It goes throughout the whole business of learning outcomes. So I would definitely recommend accessing that online. At the bottom, you have the links for both documents, and you are going to get the slides. So don't worry about taking notes. You are going to get all these materials, and you can access them. Something you may have noticed as well, in our conversations, the emphasis of learning outcomes is definitely at the programs. And this is to say, the program learning outcomes is a reference for all kind of discussions in learning outcomes. Everything is about the assessment of the program learning outcomes. All discussions in learning outcomes have to do with the program learning outcomes. And that's why it's so important, the first activity you completed, which was about identifying and drafting your program learning outcomes and align them to the CIMIC standards. If you don't have the program learning outcomes, you cannot do anything else in learning outcomes, basically. And learning outcomes put the emphasis on at the program level. What we have been doing here, and I mean, this is, I would say, normal. This is business we have been doing since so many years ago here. Is the emphasis is a little bit more, definitely in the undergrad level. It's more about, discussion is about courses, and evaluation is about the courses, not necessarily about the programs. We have the programs as well, but the emphasis has been a little bit more at the level of the courses. So is another change you may want to notice. Just briefly, typically when we're doing curriculum design in learning objectives, we tend to group courses by areas of knowledge. And we tend to discuss about the relationship between these courses within these areas of knowledge, but not necessarily among the different groups or throughout the program, which is a main difference when you are doing curriculum mapping. Actually, is a way of doing, is the way we're doing curriculum design in learning outcomes. That's the practice that is adopted by everyone doing learning outcomes. It's about curriculum mapping because it reflects one of the main principles, and is about something we have been discussing, and we're going to be discussing a little bit further now. It's about how the course learning outcomes actually assess as well the program learning outcomes. For instance, this is a quick answer to the question we had just minutes ago. How do you assess the program learning outcomes? Well, there are several ways to answer this question, but the main one has to do with the way we organize the courses in curriculum mapping. We are identifying how the assessment for the course learning outcomes can actually contribute to the assessment of program learning outcomes, which has as well some implications for the way we are designing courses. And we're going to talk a little bit further later on. And so this is one of the other differences you may have noticed. The implications for like designing courses, typically, not just in AU, is everywhere. And I'm not saying it's wrong or it's right or it's better or it's worse. It's just the way it is. So typically the practice when we design courses, the emphasis has been a little bit more on the content. We identify what kind of topics we're covering in these courses, and then we define learning activities, learning materials, and sometimes evaluation is the last thing we are actually defining. Normally talking about evaluation happening at the course level and as a summative evaluation. There's a big emphasis in summative evaluation. And I can say, for instance, many courses have, for instance, the final examination and the final assignment all together is normally 60, 65, 70%. So the main emphasis on evaluation is on summative evaluation. Whereas when we're designing courses in learning outcomes, the emphasis when we are designing the courses is on the assessment. Actually, it's an authentic assessment. We do something that is called reverse design. It's a little bit complicated, but quickly I can say it's about identifying the final assessment in the program. Uh, an authentic assessment, because authentic assessment gives the opportunity to a student to demonstrate all these skills, all this knowledge, all these attitudes that you already identified in the course learning outcomes. When you define your assessment is to assess what you identified in the learning outcomes, and that's what define the learning activities, what kind of materials and learning activities you are defining. There's a correspondence what to prepare students to master this knowledge, to develop these skills, and to prepare them for this assessment. And why the emphasis is on assessment? Because what you define at the course level, for assessment at the course level, you may want to think about how this assessment at the course level could actually contribute to the assessment of the program learning outcomes. And something else that happens when you are designing courses for learning outcomes, that's the approach, that's the suggestion anyway, is to break down this final assignment you identified at the beginning in smaller assignments, so that you may, ideally, you would have smaller assignments that build upon one another towards the achievement of the final assessment that is going to assess all the course learning outcomes, and ideally some, not all, some of the program learning outcomes. We're going to go back to this idea a little bit more in detail. I want to stop a little bit here, and I don't know, if you have identified other changes or other challenges maybe in terms of curriculum design at the course program, and because of the assessment of learning outcomes, or you want to identify what kind of challenges you are encountering while mapping the curriculum mapping of your program. Anybody has any comment you want to share with the group? Yeah, please, Jane.
In student services, we have a capstone course that helps students consolidate their learning from the required and elective courses. But what we're finding in recent years is that the level of the students entering into second-year courses is problematic. We are having trouble with students writing sentences, paragraphs, and building blocks for the level of study that we require. And so we are starting to look at the sort of building in these skill building within the course, to say each assignment will emphasize, sort of the building blocks for learning, so that, in the very first one it may be complete sentences, and the next one it may be paragraphs, and the next. But because we do not have first-year courses in that traditional way, it seems like we're going too far back for at the 200 level. And so the thing that comes to my mind is how lovely it could be to have a small number of 100 level courses with maybe only 3 credits or 6 credits in a discipline, but to give students more opportunity to start from zero and get to where they need to be. Because we haven't found the problem sort of creeping into the capstone. By the time they get to the capstone, they can do what's required. But it's more that the shock for the student who's coming in kind of fearful about whether they're going to be successful, if they've been out of school a long time, if they didn't complete school, if they don't have a GED or a diploma. To come into a second-year course is pretty daunting. And so, I would invite people to think about whether we could, within our faculty, identify maybe 50, 30 credits, 30, 45 maybe, of which they could take up to a year's worth, but maybe maybe only 5, where it would be explicitly skill building for success in university level academics. And that would help us sort of level the playing field in a more transparent way than just saying
Leading the meeting.
that we have these skill building exercises because we just want to, peculiar to this program that we want everyone to be able to perform very quickly at the same level. We do have a 300 level course that teaches them how to write an essay, and that they are very grateful for because they say, I use this template in all my other courses and it works beautifully.
Yeah.
So we know we're doing some things right, but I think there's more to be done.
Thank you very much, Jane, for your comment, and it's really interesting what you were saying because you are actually touching the main aspects of this conversation of the assessment of learning outcomes, which is improvement of the curriculum, the continuous improvement based on what you are detecting, your students' performance, and embedding, updating your curriculum throughout the program to better serve, to better help your students. And this is all about, this is the vision that actually learning outcomes is encouraging. So before moving on, I understand there, thank you, Manny. I understand there are a couple of questions in the chat room that, by the way, I cannot see because I'm sharing my screen. So anybody has any question online before moving? Any question? No? Any question in the chat room? Okay, so if there is no other comments, we're gonna start actually going into the main discussion we are gonna be we have for this morning, which is the assessment of learning outcomes. And first, I divided this part in foundational activities, work that we have already done, but we are going to review quickly for those who are joining the process. And then we're going to go to the ongoing assessment of learning outcomes strategies that I'm sure you're going to find interesting. We're going to be breaking at some point, let's say probably 10:30, a little bit later, definitely to have just a coffee break. I will let you know. But let's start the conversation. One of the foundational activities we do for learning outcomes is we already discussed this alignment of we have at the top, we're following the CIMIC standards. They are defined by the at the federal level, and they have been adopted by provinces and as the university undergrad and grad degree level of expectations. Alberta is not the exception. Then, this is one of the core ideas in learning outcomes. Then we have this university undergrad and graduate degree level of expectations at the Alberta, what is basically we know as the Alberta Credentials Framework at the provincial level, and they are aligned to the CIMIC standards. This next level of alignment is the institutional learning outcomes, and here we are talking about AU, Athabasca University, which is also aligned in turn to the provincial and the CIMIC standards. And then this is important to mention, you may have already noticed that we are talking actually about 3 levels, but it is the same because the Alberta government adopted the CIMIC standards as their undergrad and grad degree level of expectations. And Athabasca University also adopted the CIMIC standards as the institutional expression of an ideal graduate. That's why when we align our program learning outcomes, for those who have already done, we align them just to the CIMIC standards. In other provinces, for instance, in Ontario, I would say Queen's University or University of Toronto, they have their own institutional learning outcomes, and the province have their own graduate degree level of expectations and the undergrad as well, all of them are aligned to the CIMIC standards anyway. So is there any difference? Well, having our own institutional learning outcomes, which normally are aligned to the mission and vision of the universities, well, it's a good practice. It gets the university identity a little bit stronger, but not having them is fine. Anyway, we are aligned to the CIMIC standards, which is the most important thing anyway. And that's the way we are working now here in our context. Then the expectation is that the course learning outcomes is also aligned to the degree program learning outcomes. We're talking about a sort of disaggregation of the program learning outcomes in a way, but it has to do more. They're aligned through the assessment, and this is another aspect we're gonna discuss a little bit more in a couple of seconds. And at the very bottom, we have the unit learning outcomes. That is also a disaggregation of the course learning outcomes. And finally, we have in our learning units, we have these the assessment, the learning activities, the course content, which is meant to be assisting students to achieve the learning unit outcomes, which and by doing that, they are achieving the course learning outcomes. By achieving the course learning outcomes, they are in the process of achieving the degree program learning outcomes. This alignment that basically we are working on is one of the dimensions, the 3 dimensions of the key and probably the most important aspects of assessment of learning outcomes, the constructive alignment. This is one of the interpretations. There are 3 at the program level and at the course level. We're gonna talk about that. But just let me repeat, programs compose, this is a central idea, programs composed of constructively aligned courses contribute toward the achievement of program level learning outcomes. And there's another slide where we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Just let me go through this really interesting quote. I think it summarizes nicely the whole discussion about assessment of learning outcomes. The outcomes-based approach has been used to assess program learning outcomes for a number of years internationally and definitely nationally. This approach focuses on what students must be able to demonstrate, value, and can do at the end of a course and at the end of the program. The expectations are expressed as learning outcomes, as you may have noticed already, which underlie programs and courses. These courses build intentionally towards completing a coherent program, and we're going to review that aspect a little bit later because it's another central aspect of learning outcomes. It is important for all assessments to be situated in the context of the intended discipline of or profession. So everything that you are adding in your program at any level, at the learning units, at the course level, is expected to be contributing to the assessment of the program learning outcomes. The program learning outcomes is actually a sort of umbrella that you already experience what they mean. They mean the ideal graduate of profile of your in your programs. So they are very broad. They include all the course learning outcomes you are including in the program. This is the expectation. Consequently, assessments of courses can be designed to demonstrate achievements of program learning outcomes. And finally, designing courses and programs is often most effective and successful when done by teams and instructors, because as a group, you can actually identify all these trends, all these issues at the program level, all these alignments or misalignment, overlaps, or gaps. And when it is done as a group, it's a richer discussion, definitely. Before moving on, can you please identify the core elements that make possible the alignment of all learning units, courses, programs, university and provisional graduate expectations and attributes? Is there anyone who want to make a comment about this question?
Yeah, I'm just sort of wondering, like, when we start this process in a fuzzy way, often we just sort of take our stated course objective or program objectives and then just call them outcomes, and then we refine it as we go along. But what if we're well along this process and we've got everything aligned, and then we sort of say, wait a minute, if I were to do this all from scratch and just say what my program learning outcomes, but I might word it completely differently. Like, because then there's a whole chain reaction, the domino effect on alignments and stuff.
Absolutely, and your question is more than excellent. I'm going to tell you a couple of things. Actually, we are touching that aspects in the conversation this morning. What we have done so far is mapping the curriculum, the state of the art, what is out there. We are not reviewing or assessing the learning outcomes yet. This is the big difference that you are actually identifying, and thank you very much for making that point. And why we did that? We're shifting into another, from learning objectives to learning outcomes. It's not necessarily difficult, but it's not necessarily easy. And anyway, it has been a great exercise for several things. We are mapping the curriculum to identify what we have so far. And you may have already identified some trends, some issues, some good things as well. Why not to say that? But we have not yet gotten engaged in the assessment of the learning outcomes. But this exercise has been good for you to get familiar with the language, with the methodology, with the way of doing learning outcomes. But we are just halfway, honestly speaking, and we are going to get into the assessment of the learning outcomes, definitely. Jane, please.
Another way of answering this question about the core elements is to step back 2 steps and say, what is a credential? What is a degree?
Mm-hmm.
And in nursing and business, they're assisted by credential standards imposed on them in order to have accreditation. But in the arts, we don't have accreditation processes. And so on the one hand, we're a little bit freer, but we're also fuzzier because, we're saying, well, what is it that brings us all together? And the process that we're going through, I think, is going to show up a number of things, which is that for some disciplines, a highly prescribed set of courses are prescribed. And for others, there is a much narrower prescription. And we're going to have to come to terms with the fact that our different disciplines and degrees at the undergraduate level are handling or are implicitly saying degrees are not necessarily the same thing one to the other. Yet, if we had a conversation about what we think a degree is at this point, I think it could help us to get to where we want to go to by the time we get to the end of this whole process. Because for me, the T-shaped student, you've heard that expression, the breadth of knowledge and the depth of knowledge that T is the sort of body in the middle of the student, is what we're after. But we have to decide what is reasonable to expect in a 4-year degree, especially when our courses only have 3 levels to them.
Mm-hmm.
And we're pretty sure that we're comparable to what other universities do,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't yet articulate that in a way that brings us all to use the same language and
You're making a really lovely comment, and let me take a couple of things you are saying. You're making a difference between the programs of nursing and arts, and I would say is nursing, is architecture, is business. The programs here, anyway, in Athabasca University, who have to follow what the external agencies, government agencies, I guess, certification bodies, thank you, are like asking you to do, and everything is in terms of learning outcomes, if I understand well, skills that you have to, when you design your curriculum, is following whatever they're asking you to do. Whereas the fussiness in arts is that we don't have this, let's say, guidance. But the positive thing about this fussiness, let me say it that way, is that actually makes things more interesting because they are decided here. And that's why I'm saying this since the beginning. And let me emphasize again and again this idea. This is your discussion. This is your decisions. And this is your exercise. So whatever is going to be done is going to be done exactly in the same way that the groups that have identified the program learning outcomes, it's the same strategy. It's about the groups working together, deciding, identifying all this information, and defining that information for your program. So you are, in a way, you need to take ownership of this process. But that's what makes things definitely more interesting and encourages all these conversations. So you were very, very elaborated in your answer. I'm going to be a little bit more practical for this question. What makes possible this alignment is that the expression and intentional alignment of expectation at all levels are expressed in terms of learning outcomes, skills, knowledge, and attitudes. And you go by level. And it's a disaggregation process, if you want to say that. So it's a very pragmatic answer anyway. Yes, Manny, yeah.
We have a question online.
Can you please read the question? Because Stephen, can you read the question, please?
Quite long. Is the number of courses offered in a particular area?
Sorry.
Maybe you want to read it.
Yeah. Is the number of courses offered in a particular area a core element in alignment? For example, if you have one or two courses in literary theory, one course. Can you actually make it a little bit bigger?
I can read the question. So, is the number of courses offered in a particular area a core element in alignment? For example, if we have one or two courses in literary theory or one course in Canadian literature, how can outcomes be developed in a sustained way?
Yeah. What is your main reference when you are doing the curriculum design with curriculum mapping is actually your program learning outcomes, not necessarily your course. The main reference to align your course learning outcomes is the program learning outcomes. And when you are organizing your course learning outcomes, you may find some ways of when you are actually identifying the course learning outcomes, there's a way of organizing them, and actually the most important thing to see the learning trajectory of your students, which is another main element in learning outcomes. So you are definitely looking at the relationship of courses through the assessment of the course learning outcomes, and we're gonna go a little bit deeper in this topic a little bit later. Let's just finish this part, and quickly, we need another 5-10 minutes, and we're gonna break, and then we are gonna go with the ongoing assessment of learning outcomes. So part of the foundational activities was identifying these curriculum map um, um, template. Um, I know it looks a little bit scary, but the more you get related to this template, the easier is going to be the work. Basically, it reflects well, the design of this template actually was following the best practices that we identified in the literature and in other universities. We were looking at how other universities are doing learning outcomes, and we found pretty much the same kind of templates, the same way of mapping the program learning outcomes. And this is part of the foundational activities. That's part of what we have done, identifying, first of all, the curriculum, the state of the art, what we have so far, what is there, identifying issues, identifying good things, good points for the curriculum, and becoming aware of our curriculum from the perspective of the learning outcomes. We already, I'm sorry again for those who are new, we cannot stop really in topics we have already discussed, but you can always book learning designers later on to discuss a little bit more. Another of the foundational activities, and probably one of the key activities we have done, is the alignment, the identification, drafting of program learning outcomes, and the alignment to the CIMEC standards. That's the way we are aligning our program learning outcomes to the CIMEC standards. And at the same time, we are aligning them to the institutional degree expectations and the provincial ones, so, because all of them are aligned to the CIMEC standards. So we went through that activity already. What we are doing right now is identifying, Mark was right, we are identifying if we have learning outcomes or learning objectives, we are just mapping them the way they are, and later on we're going to be assessing them. The right side of the template is related to key information coming from the program evaluation handbook. Probably in the future you want to add more columns, I don't know, is going to be up to you, but definitely we just identified one of the key aspects of the program evaluation information that is requested by the government of Alberta, that is helping to actually document and your curriculum and design your curriculum. So this is a question that I really would like to do is, has the process of mapping the curriculum led you to any interesting findings already? Yeah. So that you have a little break to have a coffee, stretch a little bit, and get ready for the second part, which is going to be even more focused on the assessment of the learning outcomes. Is going to be the main part of this conversation. So see you in a second. Outcomes mean, and here is where we are moving into this assessment business of the learning outcomes, and this is where we are going to see the difference that Mark was already mentioning, the difference between just mapping the curriculum into mapping and assessing the curriculum. So that's pretty much the discussion we're going to go through. As I said at the beginning, I adopted this perspective of discussing about assessing of learning outcomes as a continuous improvement process. And this slide actually is not mine. The discussion and the perspective is this Professor Frank Bryan. It's a presentation about learning outcomes. This is actually at the bottom. You have the link for the entire presentation if you want to consult that. So I extracted some of the very interesting ideas. He says, as it is a continuous improvement process for determining what we want, measuring it, evaluating the data, and using it as a continuous improvement process to enhance the quality of the program. Let me see something really important here because I want to be very clear. What we are presenting, and definitely for this part, is best practices we have identified in the literature and in other universities. We were looking at what other universities are doing. This is not, I'm not trying to say this is the official way we are going to be doing things. No, this is not the message I'm sending. The message is exploring some ideas for discussion, for you to have this discussion and decide with the university what is going, how is going to be done, and how you are going to go through this process of learning outcomes. So let me go ahead and so this continuous improvement process has to do with identifying the learning environment, something we know very well. With identifying the learning outcomes at the program level and at the courses, aligning them, mapping the curriculum with all that information to identify how the curriculum looks, assess the learning outcomes, and analyze the evaluation. And then you start the cycle again. With all that information that you are getting from the assessment is what you are using for improving your curriculum, which translates into serving better and assisting better your students. I think it's important to remember all that is about our students. So part of this foundation, ongoing assessment strategies is the very basic one is review these program learning outcomes, course learning outcomes. We were definitely discussing about how better to draft them, to identify them, and the main idea here is to make sure our course learning outcomes are aligned to the program learning outcomes, and that's something we are going to explore even more. This is one of the central ideas for assessing the learning outcomes, and this is what actually Mark was already asking. So how we use the curriculum mapping for assessing the learning outcomes. We have mapped the curriculum, but we have not assessed the learning outcomes, and we have not updated the curriculum. It was just identifying what we have out there and what is the state of the art. So using curriculum mapping for assessing the learning outcomes actually has some implications with course design practices. Let me explain that idea. So this is what means mapping the curriculum is every time you decide how a curriculum, a course learning outcome can be mapped to the program learning outcome, you are asking yourself the question in terms of assessment, but in terms of the whatever is in your course, how it contributes to the achievement of the program learning outcomes, how these students are going to achieve these program learning outcomes through the assessment of the course learning outcomes. This is the another aspect of the constructive alignment at the program level. You can say safely that the way of assessing the program learning outcomes is through the course learning outcomes. At the end of the day, when you have all these assessment, you are going to see how these course learning outcomes, you're going to see the learning trajectory organized by program learning outcomes. You are going to see how these course learning outcomes assessment actually contributes to the assessment of the program learning outcomes. And let me go a little bit more in detail. When we go to the course level, we already said that we put the emphasis on the assessment. And this is one of the answers why. When you are defining your assessment at the course level, we already said this is looking at how to assess the course learning outcomes, the skills, the knowledge, the values, the attitudes you already identified in the course learning outcomes. And you likely want to break down this assessment, this final assessment you identified in your course in two ways. how it assesses the course learning outcomes and how it could contribute to the program to the assessment of the program learning outcomes. The same assessment, let's say, has two dimensions. The assessment of the course learning outcome at the course level, obviously, but also you are thinking about how this assessment could actually assess the program learning outcomes. So this assessment at the course level goes up to the program learning outcomes and to the assessment of the program learning outcomes and all the and everything the way you are designing your course. This is another big implication. When you are designing your course, you are thinking about how you are going to evaluate, how you are going to assess your students at the course level, how you're going to assess the course learning outcomes. But when you are designing your course, you always want to keep in mind what kind of program learning outcomes you could assess with your course, with the course that you are designing. That's why when you are assessing the course learning outcomes and when you are doing curriculum mapping, you are thinking about about two levels: the program level and the course level. So you already designed this course keeping in mind your program learning outcomes already identified, and you are defining this assessment for the course learning outcomes that you have in your course. But and at the program level, this assessment may contribute as well to the program assessment of program level outcomes, and altogether, you can safely say that all these course learning outcomes together, even though they are in different courses, are actually contributing to the assessment of the program learning outcomes. So this is something that has to do with the second part is going to be done in future, how to assess the program learning outcomes when you are doing curriculum mapping. So have you noticed all the gaps on the columns in the program learning outcomes and the rows at the course learning outcomes on the map? Do you know what they mean? Any idea? Any comments?
Take this step.
Yeah.
I mean, you expect spaces to be there because not every course is there to yield all of the program objectives. However, you would expect advanced courses to fulfill program objectives that are higher up the hierarchy, for example. And you would also expect not too many spaces. I mean, you would expect, some, intersection between a certain degree of intersection between courses at each level with certain program objectives. I guess that's what I would say.
Any other comment? Someone online?
Yeah, this is Wendell. I would just reiterate that in our curriculum mapping exercise in MAID, we found that of course, not every course is going to meet every program outcome, so you would expect gaps. The goal, I take it, is that courses should at least meet one of the program outcomes.
Yeah. Any other comment?
So Luis, I have a question for you. What would it mean if all the course outcomes were mapped to all the program outcomes in your experience?
Thank you for the question. So I'm going to try to address all the comments and your question, Stephen. Thank you very much. So part of the answer is that programs composed of constructively aligned courses contribute towards the achievement assessment of the program learning outcomes. We already discussed about that. What Mark and Wendell were saying is absolutely correct. There is just a second, in the second part of your answer, when Mark, there is something that I would like to elaborate. You are completely correct. You don't expect that one course is going to assess all program learning outcomes. It's technically impossible, and it has to do with Stephen's question, I guess. So let me answer this question from the course level. So when you are assessing when you are defining the assessment at the course level, I'm not saying that you have learning activities and assessment at every single unit. You may have 3 or 4 or 2 assessments in your course that address definitely all the course learning outcomes. And you are thinking, when you are designing this course and when you are defining your assessment, you are keeping in mind your program learning outcomes. But how many courses you have in a program? 20, 25? And all of them are different. They are addressing different aspects, different fields of knowledge. And all these differences are actually integrated in all the different program learning outcomes, which you may remember is a sort of umbrella of the skills and the knowledge that students are going to develop and master throughout the program. So it makes a little bit impossible that one single course could assess all program learning outcomes, because the nature of the knowledge that you are discussing in one course cannot actually address all the program learning outcomes that at the same time are addressing different skills and knowledge. So normally you would expect that in one course you have 2-3 different assessments, and if you took into account your program learning outcomes, it would be 2 or 3 different spaces. That's exactly what you are mapping in your curriculum, the assessments that you have at the course level, and you at the course level, when you are designing your course, you already are answering what program learning outcomes you are addressing. Probably you are addressing only 1 or 2. Remember, the program learning outcomes are very broad, very wide, whereas the course learning outcomes are more specific to the knowledge and skills that you are addressing in your course. So 1 or 2 or 3 assessments that you have in your course is just a small part in terms of the assessment at the program level. So when you are mapping, yes, you are definitely mapping probably 2 or 3 spaces typically, but you cannot map all your program learning outcomes with your course learning outcomes. It would be impossible having one course addressing all the program learning outcomes. Yeah, please.
Thanks for that explanation, Luis. Sometimes, and we have seen, Stephen, Luis, and I, several cases of these, program learning outcomes are exceptionally very broadly articulated.
Yeah.
And that makes it very difficult to eliminate, basically filled out rows for every single program learning outcome. And for one of my courses, I struggled with this issue. In one of my courses, the course learning objectives were not specific enough, and that again yielded to every single learning objectives to be easily mapped to every single program learning outcome. So it's not a desired situation. We don't want that to happen, but it all depends on the way the outcomes are articulated and how broadly they're formulated.
Yeah.
Both at the course level and the program level.
Absolutely. I think your answer is really good and address the question very clearly. And this is going to become more and more clear with practice and the way by the time we move on more and deeply in these kind of discussions. Do you wanted to say something, Jane? Do you mind, Stephen?
When we designed a capstone course for human services, we were drawing on prior learning assessment, and we wanted to have all of the human service learning outcomes in the final course. But once we started administering the course, there was a surprise element that occurred, which was that if the students used only the required courses to demonstrate the program learning outcomes, their grade would tend to be lower than somebody who could say, I actually learned some of the program learning outcomes in my electives, and I can show you how I transferred knowledge and how I synthesized knowledge, and then you kind of go, bingo, you are our ideal student. And so it wasn't something that was by design of our curriculum. It was that our curriculum was broad enough to go beyond the courses that we had, the clear plan that we had made to meet a minimum requirement, and actually extended the students' knowledge by allowing them creativity to demonstrate things other than what we required of them. And I think that has been just a real eye-opener for us, and it's one of the things that gives us the greatest pleasure, because it really shows that ownership of learning that tells you, award this person their degree right away. They've got it. So it's been and when you see the students sort of communicating this back to the instructor with such pleasure and pride, it really does affirm that our degree is, our major is really good. It delivers on what it's expecting, and that we can have it examined in multiple ways, and we believe that others will also come to that agreement, regardless of what measure they're going to use.
Before you go with your question, Stephen, thank you, Jane. Thank you, Manier. These comments from Manier and from Jane are really good, because that's the kind of things you are going to be finding with the curriculum mapping. That's the kind of discussions that curriculum mapping is encouraging you to have. And Jane is touching on a really important aspect as well in her answer. And it's about curriculum mapping is making us to be a little bit more aware of the learning trajectory we are planning for our students. But more importantly, it has been said, and Jane has been just confirming that learning outcomes actually are really good for students, because the way they are expressed, they clarify the curriculum to students, and in a way learning outcomes make students to be a little bit more aware their own trajectory, their own work in the program. It helps them to see where they are at the program at any time, and therefore to better plan their participation in the program, and clearly define what they are doing throughout this learning experience. So sorry, Stephen, please go ahead with your question.
There's a comment online from Joy Fraser. Capstone courses should relate to all of the program outcomes.
Ideally, but not necessarily. Definitely, you may want to consider capstone assignments at the program level. They could be in one of the terminal courses, 400 courses, or it could be independent. We are going to talk a little bit more about that. I don't want to repeat things. So, Joy, please let me move on, and I'm going to address your question further in a couple of minutes. Any other question, comment before I move on? Okay. Okay. direct measures for the assessment of learning outcomes. And this is very familiar for you because one of the direct measures is about for assessing the learning outcomes is actually identifying and designing assignments, how you're going to assess your course learning outcomes, the skills, the knowledge, the values you identified in your course learning outcomes. And this is something you have done brilliantly. I mean, research papers, oral interviews, research projects, portfolios, case studies, you name it. And I have read all your assignments, and they are really, really great. What you may want to do now in terms of assessing the learning outcomes is thinking not just at the course level, but you may, as I said before, you may want to keep in mind how these assessments could contribute to the program, to the assessment of the program learning outcomes. And this is one, as I said, when the Alberta government is asking you, how do you assess your program learning outcomes? Well, one of the ways is through the assessment of the course learning outcomes. So this is one of the way of assessing, planning your assessments in these two at these two levels is one of the way of assessing your learning outcomes. And I'm gonna and at the program level as well, you may want to have independently of your courses, you may want to have capstone projects, thesis, internships, terminal research papers, terminal research projects, and so on. And I'm gonna mention a little bit later why these kind of capstone assignments are important. But in the meantime, let me ask, is there anyone in the audience? Well, this is, Jane is here. So is there anyone in the audience who have experience with capstone assignments at the program level? And I was asking Jane if you please can elaborate. You already discussed this capstone assignment like 2 years ago in this learning outcomes workshop we had. And if you don't mind, do you mind to summarize what is the importance of having these capstone assignments at the program level in terms of the students' learning and reflection?
So our capstone is primarily a reflective assignment where the students aren't asked to do any more work. They are simply asked to review the course selections that they've made, the assignments that they've done. And they're to think about their learning journey, the place that they started from and where they've come to as they exit the program. So the biggest takeaway that they offer is the increased self-awareness about what they were trying to achieve by completing a degree. And they do come away with a much better sense that they have earned their degree and they can say how they've done it. And so in part, it's as if they have their elevator speech ready to tell the next employer that they're ready to go, that they have completed a degree, and that gives them more, especially confidence in tackling new challenges in the workplace, and that they have a great deal of experience and skills to offer, and that they're able to articulate their values. And we do use the knowledge, skills, and values matrix for them. And so that the assignments within the capstone take them from thinking about the breadth of their journey, the things they've been made to do, and then they have a chance to winnow it down to things where they have both theoretical knowledge and application that they then combine in ways that are unique to them. And so no two capstones are alike, but they come away with a very strong sense of their own effort and their own personal development. And it works just beautifully, and I think that in talking with the tutors for the program, we're ready to next year to offer something not, writing essays at the level that we require. And then the capstone that sort of gives that sense that they know they've earned their degree. So I think it has worked beautifully, and I'm happy to share it with anyone who's interested.
Thank you for your comments, Jane, and sorry for putting you on the spot, but I really appreciate the summary you made. It's really very well done. And addressing the Jay's question, yeah, some capstone assignments may address all your skills and knowledge in the program, but some of it is just part of the skills and knowledge in the program that students have gone through. And definitely, as Jane said, there is a big component, a metacognition component, where in that experience where students are actually reflecting and reviewing and analyzing what they have done through the program, what kind of knowledge, what kind they are mastering, what kind of skills they're developing through the program that are preparing them for the professional work they're going to be conducting later on as a graduate students. Another implication, important implication you may want to keep in mind for capstone assignments at the program level is that they are traditionally used to evaluate the quality of your programs. And this is one of the ways of answering these questions that you are going to find in the Alberta Campus Handbook, is how do you evaluate the quality of your program. And one of the practical ways is to actually use capstone assignments of students and actually use a rubric to evaluate these capstone assignments against the program level learning outcomes. And with that results, you can actually answer that question. And we are going to talk about that right now. Sorry, yeah. There's a question here. Please, Maria.
It's from Joy Fraser again, who has experience with capstones. In professional programs like nursing and health administration, the capstone courses generally have practice components and must reflect all of the program outcomes.
One of the purposes of the capstone assignments at this level is actually to reflect the professional work that students would be doing later on in the professional environment, and they are the skills that students have been developing throughout the program. So yeah.
I think she means that then all program outcomes would be. I think the point is that then all program outcomes would be mapped for this particular course, or all the levels would be covered. I think that's the point. You could probably ask Joy to talk online if you like.
Are you Joy? Do you mind to elaborate your question using your telephone?
Oh yes, hi, Joy. My point I'm trying to make is the capstone courses in the professional program is not an option, it's a requirement. That the final course in the program must be taken at the end of the program, not like in the human services program that I'm now director of. I've noticed that students were taking the capstone course whenever they felt like it. They weren't taking it at the end of the program, which really, there was no way they could be reflecting on what they did in the program. In the capstone courses in the professional programs that I've been working with for the last 30 years, the students are required to demonstrate the program learning outcomes in the capstone course, and they do this not only theoretically, but practically. They have to have practical experience to be able to actually demonstrate their competencies, skills, attitudes, and knowledge. So it's not an option that the program learning outcomes or the capstone course outcomes could relate to the program learning outcomes. They must relate to the program learning outcomes. That's the purpose of the capstone course.
Yeah, you are completely correct. Thank you for your comment. There's what probably is an option is to have a capstone course or independently of courses, you can have capstone experiences like internships or a terminal research project or a thesis. This is that's what I wanted to say. Is could be an option. You can have these capstone assignments or within courses, or properly say capstone courses, or you can have them at the end of the program as a independent experience as well.
Just clarify. In humanities and social sciences, for example, I would think it's generally not, capstone courses are generally not used in the same way they are in the professional program. So there is a difference, in the way these courses are integrated or not. But I guess I was trying to say that in some programs, professional type programs, it's a requirement usually to have a capstone course. But that wouldn't be the case in other, degree programs.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you very much. Any other comment, or shall we move on? The use of rubrics is also another way of assessing your learning outcomes, and it could be at the course level and at the program level. At the course level, I think many of you are already familiarized with the rubrics. Basically, the rubrics is going to integrate the performance descriptions and the criteria. It's going to include the criteria that you already identified in your course learning outcomes, and you are using this in a rubric with performance descriptors to actually assess the assignments you are asking students for. And this is good for assessment, and this is good for students to know in advance how they're going to be assessed. At the program level, rubrics have another connotation that have to do with capstone assignments. Let me go over there in a couple of seconds, but let me ask, anyone has any experience that want to share about the use of rubrics, and what kind of benefits can you identify because of the use of the rubrics precisely? Anyone who wants to comment here in the room or online? Yeah, please, Jane. Please, Jane.
The reason that I like to use the rubrics is that when there are multiple tutors in the same course, it helps them to grade within the same range, and the net result is that there are few occasions when students challenge a grade, because you can say quite honestly that this is likely to be how others would grade the same work. So it's very helpful for the tutors to be able to show how they're doing the grading, and then the students get used to it because they start to realize that by consulting the rubric before they begin the assignment, they can help to sort of get the points that may be available for each of the elements.
And something else is, I already said, let me elaborate this point. When you have these rubrics perfectly aligned to your course learning outcomes to assess the assignments, it's another way to answer the question how you are assessing the quality of your programs. So this is another element you may want to take into account in your practice. Indirect measures. I think we are a little bit familiar already with direct and indirect measures, and learning outcomes, they say indirect measures actually complement the big picture of assessment, because in direct measures you have, let's say, a more quantitative information, but the criteria was definitely defined by you, by professors, by the teachers. But in indirect measures, like interviews, like focus groups, you have what students, you can have the information about what students think about their own experience, their own learning experience. So it's a more qualitative information you can get, and altogether definitely complement each other and in terms of getting the big picture about the assessment in your programs. And you may want to do with the students who are enrolled. So you may want to have, for instance, the diagnosis evaluations at the beginning of the course, and it's gonna help you to identify what kind of knowledge and skills your students bring to the experience, to the course, and it may help you to calibrate, let's say that way, to calibrate your course learning outcomes. Are your expectations too high? Are too low? Or you are not as, probably you need to reinforce some aspects of the curriculum in your course. You can get that information through diagnostic evaluations. With enrolled students, you may want to have interviews, focus groups, surveys to find out their own experience, and that is very valuable information for you to know to refine and enhance your curriculum. And all that is for students anyway. You can have journals, you can have course. We have already course evaluations. Probably they need to be a little bit more aligned to the language of learning outcomes. And you have a lot of information in terms of you can get from enrolled students in terms of curriculum improvement. Let's move on, and you have the opportunity as well to do that with graduate students, follow-up. In these cases, you may want to have, let's say, interviews or focus groups about whether the program learning outcomes that you identified, does it make sense to students when they are having already this professional experience? Were they enough? The program learning outcomes you identified are actually providing them these skills and knowledge that employers are demanding from them or not. So this is, I think, is also valuable information you may want to take into account to review your curriculum. Obviously, you are already having these conversations among professors, and it's all about curriculum improvement as well. Let me stop here to ask, to what extent do you think that the practice of the assessment of learning outcomes may impact your conversations with your colleagues teaching in the same program? I hope I'm not asking difficult questions, but I would say one of the impacts that may have the practice of assessing the learning outcomes when you are having as a group these conversations is you are, for instance, identifying how well the learning outcomes are aligned, but definitely you can, for instance, identify sequence of courses, and you may want to identify something that I remember one particular case. I think it was Jill with critical thinking and someone in English 255. They wanted to have a joint assessment for the two courses. This is the kind of things you can identify in these conversations. You may want to identify assessment that could go through several years or through different courses. For instance, you may want to have an assessment that students are going to start in year 3 and they are going to complete in year 4. I think many of us actually experience that in university, and use that as a capstone assignment as well for evaluation purposes. And this is the kind of discussions learning outcomes are encouraging, like reviewing the curriculum as a group, identifying the gaps, the similarities, the overlaps, the gap, the misalignments, etc., etc. Other way of indirect measures is having these conversations with employers directly. You may want to have these conversations about the graduate students that are working with them in terms of these skills and this knowledge about their performance and at work at the professional level. And that's some of the type of information you may want to keep in mind when you are reviewing your curriculum for improvement purposes. At the program level, rubrics they are used for assessing students' work, normally with capstone assignments. That's the implication I was mentioning before. They allow the faculty having significant conversations about planning the curriculum. They encourage a culture of thinking about learning goals, measuring and taking decisions for curriculum improvement, and encourage discussions about teaching and learning. And this slide is dedicated to Mark Sells, because he was asking me this question so many times. And it's actually using rubrics for setting up your expectations. This example that comes as well from this professor at Queen's University, Frank Bryan, he was talking about an engineering program, and they identified three main attributes for graduate students: problem analysis, design, and communication. So in advance, they got all together to discuss how they would like to see to embed these attributes in the curriculum, and you can do it by year. You want to see in the you want to embed in the curriculum these attributes at different levels by year. Directly addressing the question, Marcel's question is, for instance, he was asking me how to embed the information literacy skills throughout the curriculum in our programs. Well, this is something you can use. You can do by using rubrics. You can discuss at what level you want to see these core professional skills or professional skills throughout the program, and you can embed them in your curriculum. And it could be in teaching, learning materials, and learning activities, definitely in assignments and reflected in rubrics. And you define in advance all these criteria, and later on, when you are reviewing your courses and your curriculum, you embed that expectations. Another more interesting way to use the rubrics for assessing the learning outcomes is, for instance, following the same example. You can define a rubric with that attributes, the problem analysis, design, communication. It could be anything you may want to identify in your programs. Could be information literacy skills, communication, and critical thinking, for instance. And you want to select one course, ideally a terminal course, but could be with any kind of course, and where you have a capstone assignment. And you are going to use these students' capstone assignments to be analyzed with the rubric. And you identify in your rubric not just the attributes, but the performance descriptors to analyze the capstone assignments. And at the end, you can translate all this information into a chart, like we have, the one that we have on the screen. And this is going to tell you pretty much how your students are performing in terms of these attributes that you are identifying. And this is going to trigger the conversation about what is missing, what is wrong, what is working well, what can be improved, what can be enhanced, what can be transformed in your curriculum. So this is another way of assessing the quality of your learning outcomes in your program. Another really interesting example is plotting your students' experience throughout the program. So you may want to do exactly the same idea that you did in one course, but you may want to do that throughout the 4 years. So you identify capstone assignments at the year 1, year 2, year 3, and year 4. And they are, for instance, using problem solving and critical thinking. And I don't know if you can see, they have the criteria they are using defined. For instance, for critical thinking, they have explanation of issues, evidence, context, assumptions, student's position, conclusions, and outcomes. And then you define the descriptors. And with these rubrics, you assess the capstone assignments by year. And with that results, you can plot all that information. And you can see how your students are performing throughout the program. For instance, in the chart that is in the right, is you see from year 1 to year 2, actually the points are going down. So this is telling you there is an issue in your program. And instead of your students improving, actually they're getting lower in their performance. So this is indicating you that you have an issue in your curriculum that you may want to identify and actually you want to address and improve in your curriculum. So this is another really interesting way to assess your learning outcomes by looking at your students' performance. And with that results, you may want to address your curriculum as a result. Please, Dale, your microphone, please.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's what the diagram is telling you, because if students are in a program and they're taking courses, they're not unlearning. They're not getting less. They're not going down in what they previously knew. What happens sometimes when you do initial assessments, say, for example, in self-assessment of what people think they know about particular areas, they'll rate themselves higher at the start. And when they start taking the classes, they realize that they didn't know as much as they thought they knew. So the learning, they are learning, but their evaluation of where they're at actually goes down because they're correcting for their initial overestimated assumptions. So you're not actually unlearning. It's telling you something, but you have to be careful on what you think it's telling you.
Yeah, you are absolutely right, and this is actually the main purpose: identifying what's going on.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one interpretation, but it could be any, and this is what you, as a group, are gonna find out in your discussions.
Because I mean, overall, the assessment of learning outcomes and the planning of them and the mapping of them, etc. I think it's a good thought exercise. It's a good planning exercise, kind of assessment exercise, but we have to be, I think, very careful that it doesn't give you specific information. It cannot. When you've got, say, 8 or 10 program learning outcomes for a 4-year program, it can't be specific. And it's kind of exemplified. This is not a critique of your presentation, by the way. Which
No. Your comments are more than excellent. Thank you.
What I was going to say is that if the learning objective mapping template was detailed and complete and self-explanatory, then we wouldn't need a single one of these other slides. And the fact that we do means there's a whole bunch more embedded in there. So the process of going through it, thinking about it, correcting it, is useful. Mm-hmm. But we need to get out, like some of the comments from the professors in Ontario, that it's going to give you exact and detailed things of what students get in their program. It's just not true. It isn't. Which doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing the exercise, but you always have to be careful on what it is you think you're getting out of it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, and I would say that the main point in this would be actually analyzing the curriculum as a group, finding out what's going on, and the best answer is going to be coming from you, from the group. And yet, before we get that expertise in learning outcomes, before we get that level of expertise, I think it's safe to say that it's a good practice to do the analysis independently how you want to do with charts, with rubrics, whatever idea you want to adopt. I think is a good practice. That's the point. Whatever practice you adopt, is the point is to analyze what's going on in your curriculum, and with whatever answer you get, use it for improvement purposes.
Just one thing I'll add for you online that you couldn't see, as Louise was saying that, I'm nodding, because I'm agreeing with what he's saying. Of course, you have no idea online that was what.
Thank you for your comment. Yeah, it's very challenging to facilitate a conversation online and on site. So we are actually coming to an end, very close. So again, whatever kind of assessment approach, strategy you want to use, the intention is to reflect that information in your curriculum at the program and at the course level, or if you want to say that in the other way around, at the course level, and then reflect that at the mapping level, and then it is going to definitely impact, hopefully in a very positive way, in terms of your curriculum design. And this is the last slide, and on purpose I'm not going to say a lot, because this is the topic for the second workshop, which is the next week, and it's going to be Stephen, my colleague Stephen, leading that presentation. I just want to say very quickly that data analysis is another strategy to assess your learning outcomes. Is one of the most common practices, and is actually using whatever information. Remember, we have information about what course learning outcomes are assessing your program learning outcomes. Secondly, we have the information at what level, foundational, developing, and advanced. And thirdly, you have the information about how you're assessing the learning outcomes, what kind of assessments. So all that information can be processed in let's say, using frequency analysis and represented by charts, and it's gonna give you a lot of information about what's going on in your curriculum, but on purpose. I'm sorry, I'm not saying more, because this is the topic for the second. It's a very interesting, but it would be very long for now, and I think everyone is a little bit tired, and I would stop there, just opening the floor for questions. Please come up with whatever kind of question you may have in mind. I just put out there some questions you may want to take into account if you want to address them, or you want to come with your own question, and the floor is open for questions and for any other comment you want to add to this discussion this morning. Yeah, please.
One second. I'll ask people online first this time if they have any questions or comments. If you have a question, you can type in the chat box, and we can see it there, and then ask you to turn on your mic. Jane, you had a comment.
Yeah. For a couple of years now, I've been saying that Athabasca University should have some university-wide learning outcomes. And when I've asked some of the academic leaders about this, the answer is we have them. And I sort of document is created a pan-Canadian standard, and then Alberta adopted the CMEX standard. But it may be that Athabasca has some unique university learning outcomes that we want to champion because it's part of the cachet of our degree.
Our identity.
Our identity, that's right. So, from the, I would like to see FHSS kind of assert its intellectual muscle on this to say, well, most of our courses, most of our programs do require university level communication, critical thinking, research methodology, and professionalism of some kind, or ethical conduct. So those seem to me to be sort of four that our faculty have adopted. But there might be a fifth one that is digital literacy for the university as a whole. But it would seem to me that, if we took the initiative on this and tried to say that, we think that there are these things, and then other faculties could say, we think that there are these other things, we would at least expand the conversation to say, is there anything unique about what we're doing, or are we falling in lockstep with, just sort of whatever CMEC is doing, which is so general that it doesn't really, we want to align with them, but we don't need to be identical with them. So I'm wondering if other people have had any thoughts on this.
Thanks, Jane. I can partially respond to that comment. I couldn't agree with you more, and the question has been raised on multiple occasions by members of the working group in charge of drafting the monitoring report. I believe when they say the learning outcomes at the institutional level are there, they mean that they are embedded in the university's mandate and mission statements, right? That's what I have basically been able to infer from some of the discussions. But this doesn't mean that the question has been raised. They are aware of it, and we do need institutional learning outcomes to be able to do the mapping that we are engaged in right now in a more concrete way, in a more productive way, so to speak. Other comments or questions?
There's one online. There's a comment online from Mino. Jane preempted my question. I hope that we can adapt this process to reflect the uniqueness of our undergraduate and postgraduate structures.
Yeah, I want to add a little bit more to what Manija and Jane said. Definitely, yes, you can find these the learning outcomes in the mission and vision, but this is not necessarily telling in a clear language to students what the institutional learning outcomes are in terms of their learning. And something that Jane touched that I want to elaborate is about digital literacy. And this is very, very unique for distance education. And this is the kind of skills that not necessarily students are getting in other traditional face-to-face universities. And this is the kind of skills that everyone these days need for whatever kind of work you are doing. Working with people at distance, this is very usual in Canada. Working with people in different provinces at distance, using the computer, the teleconference, what we are doing now, we are so used to do it. But it requires a lot of skills. I'm still coping with that, by the way. It's very challenging to do these kind of conversations online and on site. This is very common for us, but not for these face-to-face traditional students, and it would be interesting to reflect that in these institutional learning outcomes to reinforce our identity as a university, definitely. Anyway, any other comments online in the room? Yes, Jane.
I have a question, this is Wendell.
Please go ahead, Wendell.
Yeah, first of all, thanks, get a lot of echo here. Thanks for a great presentation, Louise. Now, what I want to hark back to is something you were saying at the beginning, or something just kind of casually mentioned in passing, actually. Periodically, reference was made to assessing skills, knowledge, and values. Could you please say a bit more about what you mean by values and exactly what it means to assess them? I think of values as, normative issues. And if we're going to, like, the way I understand assessing values would be something you would do in an ethics class where you would assess the student's ability to understand the arguments supporting the adoption of certain values, not as instilling values in the student, right? So I was just wondering what you meant, when you use the word values and assessing values, what you mean by that, and how are you thinking about assessing them?
I would say it's more about the attitudes, is students' attitudes. And in terms of evaluation, that's what I try to refer with the discussion of having the direct measures and the indirect measures. So direct measures, probably when you are doing direct measures, is a little bit more difficult, definitely, to evaluate these attitudes. But you may want to embed that, for instance, in the questions you have for the students when you are asking for papers. You may embed that, but definitely the most indirect assessment can deal more directly with students' attitudes. So that's why they are always mentioning that indirect and direct measures complement each other in terms of getting the big picture of assessment. Please, Dale.
Could you give me an example of what you mean by attitude, Louise? By a student's attitude?
That's something, well, Louise is
Behavior.
mentioning, but that's something I was going to comment on too. I mean, your question started out talking about values as in ethical values. That's not necessarily the values we're talking about. It could be values, learning values. So the importance of being able to express yourself, to critically think, to independently learn, to have continuous learning, those kinds of values as opposed to moral ethical principles.
They're still normative, though. I mean, what you're talking about is still normativity. The value of doing this as opposed to doing that. The value of this over that.
I mean, yes, it's still normative, but it's not in the same way, and it is something you can embed directly in learning. And like Mark Crawford decided, his inclusiveness. So, for example, if you have components of TRC in your courses, there's cultural inclusiveness, and those are things that you can embed as opposed to.
Okay, so what we're talking about then, Dale, are predetermined values that the instructor holds and that he or she embeds in the course. Like, I may value inclusiveness, and then I embed that in the course. Right? I mean, that's what we're talking about. Something more instructor driven.
Well, I mean, the instructor's going to have some influence, of course, but you're going to have universal. This is the kind of discussion that we're talking about for institutional values, the importance of say, critical thinking, professionalism, clarity in writing, etc.
Academic integrity is the one that comes to mind most often. To me, that the students should take ownership and responsibility for their own work, and when they don't, that is, a very serious breach in my view, because I would think that employers wouldn't want people who pass off other people's work as their own.
That is a normative ethical value. Like Dale was mentioning, critical thinking and that sort of thing, I wouldn't call those values. I would call them skills.
And so values, outcomes, attitudes, I think we all, I'm not sure this forum is the place really to talk about the differences, but this is a great question, Wendell, and perhaps you, Louise, and maybe others who would be interested can have this conversation offline. But I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to be here. This was a very educational, thought-provoking session for me, and I'm sure for many others. Great discussion, really in-depth comments and questions. And nobody else has any comments or questions? Just want to say goodbye and see you next week at 9:30 for the second part, on the 23rd for the second part of this workshop. And special thanks again to the workshop organizers, Stephen and Louise, and
Leading the meeting.
for his really excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much to everyone, and see you next week.